Hello. So this is our first official class video for our, we could call it many different things as far as the literature and composition class. I think we should just call it our heroes class because it's going to take on a lot of different shapes, but that's the theme for the year. And our major discussion will center around the concept of a hero and the evolution of the concept of a hero throughout time because they really changed. However, what we're going to key in on is how can we identify characteristics which are timeless, which hold the spark of absolute truth within them, something we would find in the Bible, and which we can still identify today. Ideally, at the end of class, you will come to a place of being able to read anything for the rest of your life and identify how these heroes you're reading about fall in line with what we discuss in this class. So this initial video is going to introduce you to Charles Dickens because some of you are already beginning to read a little bit of Tale of Two Cities. The rest of the class, we will only go in chronological order, starting with Beowulf and ending with The Hobbit. But because this is the summer reading, it would be good to have an intro to both the author, the time period which produced the text, and then I'll do a second recording talking a little bit more about the heroic concept and the novel itself. So let's start with Dickens. He was the most famous novelist during the Victorian period. Usually, when we're reading about a period hundreds of years later, we don't end up reading the authors who were the most popular necessarily. However, Dickens is extraordinary in that someone who was very popular to the masses at his time has also stood the test of time and is still considered this wonderful author to read today, like important to read a lot of his works. I could tell you a lot about Dickens because we know so much, which is a blessing. We're close enough to his time period that we can touch the same things he touched. We can visit the same streets he walked upon. We can hold his original manuscripts in our hands. And that's extraordinary because we're starting all the way back with Beowulf. That stuff is not cut because that was all oral tradition and we have to really use our imaginations. But with Dickens, we know so much. I'm going to narrow it down to the things that will help you understand why he wrote Tale of Two Cities, what message he may be trying to communicate to his audience, and how that's relevant for you in this class. So Dickens grew up in a family that was very loving, was very artistic, and was highly unstable because his father didn't want a normal job. He wanted to be an extraordinary man and believed he could get by on charm, on not a great work ethic, and on the kindness of his friends. He ended up in massive debt. And during the Victorian period, they had something called a workhouse. So a family member would be arrested because of their debt. They'd be thrown in jail. And then the other family members would be forced to live in a workhouse and work off the debt of the family member who was in jail. That wouldn't be true of, like, let's say you had a teenage son who got into debt. You wouldn't have that situation. But if a parent did, that's where the children would end up, and oftentimes the wife. So Charles, when he was very, very young, 6 or 7, he ended up in a workhouse. They're about as bad as you can imagine. They were kind of like horrible orphanages, except with no education. And because the kids were little, they could do fine mechanic kind of work. And so Dickens had to work with his little fingers, building things all day long, working with different kinds of machinery. I forget what the primary thing is he built, but it was a very miserable experience. He survived on rats. For part of his time there, he was heavily bullied because he was brilliant, and the other kids thought that Charles believed he was better than them. And so they picked on him a lot, and he was kind of scrawny. So as he got older, he began helping take care of his father and his mother but he reacted to his youth and it formed his identity as he became an adult and especially as a writer. And so you see him with this extraordinary work ethic. During the Victorian period was the first time in history that people were really being paid to be professional writers. There really wasn't such a thing before the last 100 years before him. Back to the Romantic period in the 1700s, that's as early as people could be paid to be professional writers ever in history. So during that time period, the novel, the long book, became a popular household item. The people who could afford the novel were upper middle class and upper class. They were also the ones educated who could afford an education and knew how to read. The lower class and the lower middle class usually were illiterate. So you have to bear in mind that Dickens needed to write in a way that would appeal to people who already had money. They would want to have their worldview, the way they saw themselves in the world. They'd want to have that reinforced. They wouldn't want that rocked. But for Dickens, it was so important that he make everyone aware of the horrible conditions children were growing up in the lower classes. So that's a difficult, tricky thing to do. But you see him doing it brilliantly. And especially in Tale of Two Cities, what he did to get around criticizing the society of his day was to set his novel 100 years before, during the French Revolution. So he was able to say, here are these bad things that are happening in the world, but they were happening 100 years ago. I'm not talking about you guys now. You're fine. You see what I mean? So he was able to appeal to his public and subtly get his message in there without overtly critiquing. So that was brilliant. Dickens was a household name. He had his own magazine he published that would come out with these, like a chapter every week or every 2 weeks of these huge long novels he would write. And he would pay himself by the word. So he wrote really long chapters, which is why your book is like this big or 18 hours, for which I apologize. In truth, you could really cut some of that out. So once again, if you ever start to get lost as you're reading and you're meandering around, go to Spark Notes and read all through the previous chapters to catch you up, to get you straight on what's happening. Because one thing that Dickens does that is my favorite thing he does is use all these different characters and all these different occurrences in his book. And you think, man, what is this? Why are we over on this London street all of a sudden? We were just in France. Why are we jumping around? What does this little street urchin boy have to do? Why are we following him around for 40 pages, Charles? What's the point of this? And then we just drop him and you don't hear about him forever. At the end of these incredibly long stories that Dickens wrote, everything ties in. There's always one or two major plot twists that you seriously do not see coming. He blinds you with all of his words, so you can't tell how this is all going to tie together. Max has read way more because he wrote about Dickens in college, but we have read these novels together and challenged each other to try to figure out what the twists are going to be. And I had so many times I thought I got it and I didn't. And I was looking for the twist. I thought I had it. So trust me that in my opinion, Tale of Two Cities has the best payoff for the long novel. You get through it and at the end you'll be like, no way, that was that guy the whole time. Like, it's really good. Usually there's a murder. In this one, a lot of people die. So it's during the French Revolution. So it's very bloody, but it's usually not described in any kind of way that would disturb you. So he was a social activist at heart. Dickens adored children. He ended up having 10, 12 of them. His personal life is not the best. When you're older, I encourage you to look into it because it's very complicated and interesting, but just trust me, He didn't grow up in a stable home and he didn't create a stable home for his family. However, he was known as the champion of the family in all of his public works because he wrote so glowingly of how important family is. So that is my brief intro to Charles Dickens, still one of the best-selling authors of all time. He's credited as the man who invented Christmas, which actually isn't true, but for the British population, he certainly made Christmas a sentimental holiday by writing A Christmas Carol. Before that, they didn't have traditions like a Christmas tree in the home or the concept of a Santa visiting them or eating a big Christmas goose, which stuff we're used to now. Nobody did. It wasn't a time for gathering with family and friends until after he wrote A Christmas Carol. So he was someone who changed the shape of culture as we know it. He would sit down. He had a really interesting regimented style. Like I told you, his father was had a very poor work ethic. So Dickens said, I will never be poor. My children will never starve. And he wrote like it was his job. He took it seriously to an obsessive point where he would give himself a schedule he had to follow every day. It's something you can look it up online, but it's something like he'd wake up at 6, have breakfast, go for an hour walk, write for 3.5 hours undisturbed, have lunch, go for an hour walk, write for another 5 hours undisturbed, have dinner. So it was something like that, but he did that all 7 days of the week. So that is my brief but important intro to Dickens. You will always find him sympathetic to children in his novels. You will see him really looking out for the lower classes, for the poor and the oppressed. That's where his heart was. And so as you move forward, he was paid by the word. You are right when you say this is a very long novel. It is. But the words are beautiful. And his command of his plot is second to none. There's just nobody better at writing a complicated mystery before there were such things as mysteries. Amazing. So I hope you enjoy it.